highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
It is a great honor for me to be able to introduce to you and moderate a Q&A tonight with a large sampling of the people who are most responsible for the film that we've just seen. Obviously, first and foremost among them, please welcome Steven Spielberg. Please now welcome the screenwriter, Tony Kushner. And now for our cast members. First of all, please welcome Lee Pace. Next, James Spader. Next, David Strathairn. Next, Sally Field. And finally, Mr. Lincoln himself, Daniel Day-Lewis. The first question I'd like to pose to Mr. Spielberg, I wonder if you can talk about the roots of your personal fascination with Lincoln and how a conversation back in 1999, so quite a while ago already, with Doris Kearns Goodwin sparked the idea of doing a film about him.
Well, I think I forgot my long fascination with the 16th president, and I think that Doris reminded me of really how compelled I was by the mystery of what I didn't learn in school about Abraham Lincoln when she first met with me in 1999 to do a Millennium Project for CBS, and she was one of the consultants on the project, and I was asking her what she was currently writing, and she said, I'm writing a story about the Lincoln presidency. And that was the moment for me, just a bit of an awakening that suddenly is kind of like my childhood flashed before me, and I remember all the moments that Lincoln had meant something to me growing up in school. I don't know why. I have no idea why, of all the presidents we studied in elementary and high school, why this particular person stood out more than anybody else, but I think it was because he was really awkward and looked like an outsider, looked like somebody I would be friends with. And it just didn't seem very presidential. And the things he did, his deeds were much stronger than his physical appearance would have suggested, that he would have earned the right to be on Mount Rushmore and the right to be on the money and the right to have a memorial and so many things named after him. So that was just really it. And then once Doris began to send me chapters, before the publisher got the chapters, by the way, I realized that she was doing something that had not been done before. It was a really, really personal journey throughout Lincoln's presidency.
And from what I've read, you knew very early on that you wanted Mr. Day-Lewis for Lincoln. I wonder Mr. Day-Lewis, when you first heard about this, were you so sure that you wanted the job?
No, I was hiding. I was both amazed and delighted and absolutely bewildered in equal measure that Stephen would even consider me for such a thing. But at that time, and it was actually some years before Tony wrote his version of the story, as much as I felt that could really be a wonderful job for somebody else, it didn't. I didn't feel that irresistible tug into the orbit of the life of the man or the greater life of his world, and that came much later on. So I didn't have to struggle with temptation, but I was just astonished that Stephen would invite me to do it.
And Mr. Kushner, how did it first come to be that you heard about this project and then arrived at the conclusion that it was not going to be the kind of movie where you could tell the whole story? You were going to have to hone in on a very select, brief portion of his life, and in order for it to ever be shown in a theater.
The first time I heard about it was I had breakfast with Kathy Kennedy in, I think, 2003, when Angels in America was airing on HBO, and Kathy was in town and asked to meet with me, and I asked her, what are you and Steven working on? I'd never met Steven, and she said a film about the murder of the Israeli Olympic athletes in Munich, and a film about Abraham Lincoln. And I said, well, those are very exciting projects, and thanks for breakfast. And things happened, and I don't think, I've been trying to remember, I don't think we ever talked about Lincoln while we were making Munich, but then about 5 or 6 months after Munich was released, Steven called and asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. Doris's book is a masterpiece. It's 700 pages. It's a 4-way political biography, and it's the living definition of a book that isn't going to make a 2.5-hour film. And the more I read about the Lincoln administration, the more convinced I became that you could take, and I don't think this is in any way an exaggeration, you could take any week of the 4 years that he spent in the White House and make a 10-part miniseries with no... I finally decided to do the last 4 months and wrote a screenplay that was 500 pages long. This is the first quarter of that. It's a life that's so insanely packed with incredible dramatic incident. So figuring out how to boil it down was something that Steven and I struggled with for 4.5, 5 years.
5 years.
And I'm approaching this somewhat chronologically, so I don't want the folks in the middle to... I am coming to you. I just want to ask first, Mr. Day-Lewis, another question here, which is that I understand when you signed on to do this, you sort of had a request that it be held off for a year. And I want to ask you and Mr. Spielberg, well, let me put it this way. Another interview, you had said that initially saddened you a little bit because I think you wanted to get going, but you ultimately found that it was really beneficial. And so I just want to ask both of you what the product of that year, what some of the benefits of that year were.
Well, it's hard to describe a year, but just in a general way, I'm a very slow reader, and I had a lot of reading to do, and a lot of reading that I needed to do, a lot of reading that I wished to do, and then I suppose if you can divide any period of preparation into 2 parts, you sense that there is a line drawn somewhere, and it's not always known to you where you will come up to that line, but the line basically separates the objective experience, which would include learning, from the more subjective work of trying to grow towards an understanding of that life from I also was grateful to have that time because I knew Tony was still working, and I thought it would afford us all a period during which we could discuss the ways in which the story was developing. But more than anything, it's you know, when I was fairly young, I figured out just for myself, and everyone finds a different way of doing things, but I like to do things slowly. I like to grow into an understanding of things, and I feel that the illusion that one creates for oneself finally is that the decisions make themselves, but you can only really have that illusion with time in my case, and I have a slow rhythm.
Well, the year was at first, yeah, of course, I was disappointed because when Daniel committed, I said, oh my God, we'll be shooting in 4 months. And Daniel said, what do you mean 4 months? And he really told me that he needed a year to get ready and to read. But that year turned out to be a blessing. And it gave Tony and I a lot more time to delve more vertically into Lincoln and the minutia, the details, which I think we celebrate. I think this film celebrates more. Of all the movies I made, I think there's more details that I care about in this film than anything else I've ever done. And I think a lot of those details occurred the year we had to find them. And the other thing was it gave me time to cast 145 speaking parts. That's a lot of parts. That's more roles than I've ever had in any single movie until now. And it made possible for actors like David Strathairn, who always has a huge busy schedule. It made time for Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who plays Robert Lincoln, who was absolutely unavailable and would not have been able to play Robert had we made the film in 4 months. A lot of the actors who were not free during that time, but were still my first choices, became free because we waited a year.
Once you had your Lincoln, you needed your Mrs. Lincoln, and Ms. Field, I've again seen you and heard you talk about the fact that it was a sort of you felt you wanted to convince Mr. Spielberg that that you were right for this part. You hadn't been in movies for a few years, and I know there were some other reservations or things that may have come up, and I just wonder for you, can you talk about how it did come together? Because it's I think a beautiful story how it all worked out.
Testing. Thank you so much. So that little button does such a wonderful job on that machine, doesn't it? This is a long story. I'm going to try to make it shorter because we have so many wonderful people here to talk. Let's see how fast I can talk. He moves slowly. I move very, 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 very fast. So, take my time. So, I've been watching for Mary forever. I felt always in my heart as an actress that there would be certain roles that are right for me. Mary was always one of them. They'd never really explored Mary at all. And I heard that Doris Kearns Goodwin was writing a book. I heard she was writing a book on Abe and Mary at the time. It turned out to be Team of Rivals. I heard that Steven had purchased it. I somehow let it be known that, oh boy, would I be interested. He came to me in 2005, I think.
Earlier.
Was it earlier? And said, would I be Mary? And I was like, oh my God, yes, I'll absolutely be Mary. But in my heart, I thought, there's a lot of slip between cup and lip, as they say. And so many years had gone by, and writers came and went, and then Tony Kushner came on board and delivered the most exquisite piece of writing perhaps I have ever read. And I went, okay. And then Daniel Day-Lewis came on board and went, in my heart, here comes the battle. The battle is a lot of obvious things. First of all, there needed to be this battle for Mary to be known. Both, I needed to pull it out of me in this tenacious way, and Steven needed to see that and be a part of it, and ultimately, Daniel was a part of it. Steven thought he should walk away. He didn't see us together. I argued with him and said, "You're wrong." And I said, "Please test me." He said, "Okay." the generous Mr. Spielberg tested me. It wasn't quite right. Daniel was off in his process newly and in Ireland, which is far away. I was in California. And so we couldn't ask him to come and be a part of this. I did it by myself. And Steven said, I put you together with some film of Daniel. It just isn't going to work. And I said, God, thank you. Thank you for this chance. Then the really good news is I didn't kill myself that day because Steven called me the next day and said he couldn't get it out of his mind, that he walked around the lot all day, and also he had talked to Daniel. And they had sent Daniel the footage, and yikes. And he wanted to meet me, and Steven said, this is a great idea, let's all go to New York and meet. And so we were trying to make that happen, and then all of a sudden they're calling me and saying, do I want the same hair and makeup people? And I said, for a cup of coffee? Okay. No, it was that generous person number 2, Daniel, I think, now they never told me, I'm surmising, they will never tell me what went on between the two of them. All of a sudden Daniel was flying in for the day from Ireland to test with me on film so that Steven could see us together, and that's what we did. We met, early version of Mr. Lincoln, early version of Molly, Mary, and spent an afternoon doing some very long and very strange improv. I can't remember one single word we said. Probably I talked a lot and you talked very little. And I said, thank you very much. This was an amazing afternoon, and I'm terribly grateful.
And I wasn't recording sound. Did you know that?
You weren't?
No.
Oh my God, I was brilliant that day. You can't believe how good I was. That is insane. Probably a very good idea, ultimately.
I was recording sound.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Anyway, I was driving home and my phone rang. It was Daniel and Steven together on the phone saying, will you be our Molly? And so I was. Thank you so much.
One of the things, as Mr. Spielberg referenced, so many interesting parts in this film, but I wonder, and I want to pose this, if I may, as a group question, Mr. Schrathern, Mr. Spader, Mr. Pace, you are all people who have starred in productions of your own, many, some of the best of the last few years, last decades, and yet when you get a script that offers a supporting part, but it's from a Tony Kushner script and directed by Steven Spielberg, do you have to hesitate for a second, or do you say, I'm excited to be in regardless? Whoever, Mr. Strathern, would you like to go first? I think of all the great things that I've seen you in, and I just wonder if that's even crosses your mind when you see the material.
No, it didn't. I mean, it was, you answered the question. Yeah.
Mr. Pace, Mr. Spader.
Oh, yeah, is this working?
Yeah.
Have I got?
The button.
Yeah. Thrilled. I mean, it was a call of a lifetime for me to get invited to the set. And to be on the set and work with all these incredible actors and on this script, you know, with Steven Spielberg. Yeah, job of a lifetime. I learned so much, and yeah.
I have to say that I saw Lee do an independent film with a wonderful director, Max Winkler, a film called Ceremony, and I saw two really amazing performances in the film. There were many good performances in the film, but I saw yourself, Lee, and I saw I guess the other one was Jake Johnson. And so I began asking Max about this guy because Tony and I had an idea about Fernando Wood, that rather than have somebody who is spewing so much hatred and racism, you know, cast somebody in the part that is like Errol Flynn, and then have that stuff come out of the mouth of Errol Flynn. And does it make it any more or less acceptable? It was a kind of an interesting litmus test. And so we didn't go for an obvious person that would have twisted their face into the look of someone who has spent so much time, with a black light in their heart. And Lee didn't test or anything. We just gave you the part, and he first day of shooting, and we didn't even talk about the accent. He just gave you the part.
I remember coming to set and kind of standing there in that, the room was a little about this size, wasn't it? The Congress that we shot at the Capitol in Virginia, and kind of starting that big monologue. That was my first day working, wasn't it? And I was just like...
And then Tony rewrote the monologue, and you had to memorize it in 4 minutes.
Oh, I remember that too.
So once things got, well, I'm hoping Mr. Spader wants to add something, but I don't know, I guess not.
I'm really the layabout in this bunch. I showed up at the last minute and just had more fun making this film than any in memory, with the most delightful people, many of whom are here tonight and many of whom are not. It really was just, I just wished it hadn't ended. And when I looped the film, I wished it hadn't ended again. And then when I saw the film, I called Daniel immediately and said that seeing him, and Steven was the next call, and told them both that seeing the film the first time, all it made me do was miss them so desperately. So really, for me, this was just my absolute pleasure.
Wow. I think, if I'm correct, this all was shot towards the end of last year. Is that right? And over the course of 4 months and very long days. And I just wonder if you, Mr. Spielberg, can talk about the way that you dressed and addressed these folks, because I think that both would be unconventional, not what you've historically done on your sets. And I just find it interesting if you could talk about why.
Well, I think the approach to this was, to create a kind of just a kind of womb of authenticity, a room and a womb. And the Rick Carter sets were extraordinary, and they were absolutely reproductions of the White House as it existed in 1865, even with assumptions made about the color of the wallpaper based on research that we had all done and Rick had done, what the rugs looked like. And Rick just did an amazing job with just, not a lot of money. I mean, this was not one of our hugely expensive projects. But the whole feeling for me was that, and I think a lot of this was tacit, it was unspoken, that there was such admiration for Abraham Lincoln among the crew and the cast. I didn't have to say it a lot. I didn't have to give a bunch of ground rules about how we're going to conduct ourselves, comport ourselves in a different way than we may have comported ourselves on other movie sets, which often are raucous and fun and everybody, it's a family. It's sometimes even a bit like a circus. And in this case, I didn't have to say very much. Everybody came with a kind of reverence to the material, to Tony's script, to Daniel and what he's contributed to. Already a lifetime of contribution. It would have been anybody else's 9 or 10 lifetimes what he's done in the short span of years he's been telling stories. And we all basically didn't speak. I mean, I set a tone in a way by deciding to call everybody by their character names and not by their surnames. So, you were Mr. Wood. Tommy Lee Jones was Mr. Stevens. Mr. Secretary, I never called David Strathairn anything except Mr. Secretary. Sally, I called Molly or Mary Todd. And of course...
You called me Mrs. Lincoln, I think.
And Mrs. Lincoln too, when I was really, well, yes.
You were
I
upset
did
with
when
me
I was
then.
upset
Go
with
ahead
you.
and say it.
Yeah, only that.
I heard you yell Jimmy once from the floor.
Yes, I yelled Jimmy. I lost my head, okay? One time I lost my head, and I yelled at Jimmy. I don't know why I did that. And of course, Daniel, I called Mr. President, and I just simply came dressed in a regular, nice nice suit every day. I've read that I had Joanna Johnson put me in period costume. That never happened once. Not even for Halloween, that never happened. But it was nice because the thing that I will never forget, when we had a lot of actors in one space, and we asked the actors if they would just remain seated while we made a slight lighting adjustment, which sometimes takes 15, 20 minutes, and never gave any rules about how you conduct yourselves when you're sitting around waiting for Janusz to move the lights around. But no one spoke. No one spoke. No one talked about home life. No one talked about the 21st century. No one talked about politics today. Everybody just sat there very quietly waiting for the next shot. And I've never, ever had that happen to me on any set before. So, and that was throughout the entire production.
And Ms. Field, I wonder if you can share along those same lines, but sort of humorously, your communications with Mr. Lincoln were sometimes did blur into the 21st century technology, and I just wonder if you can explain how some of your cell communications with Mr. Lincoln work.
Well, it's not really that odd, really, when you think about it. I too had quite a number of months, thank God, because he was reading books and I was eating. I had a lot of weight to gain. So he was in Ireland, I'm in Los Angeles. There was no way for us to begin to form any kind of relationship. We knew that we would hit the ground running. This was a very tight budget. There would be no rehearsal time. You know, we didn't have the luxury of 2 or 3 weeks rehearsal. And so he actually started, it was great. I was doing a lot of research while I was eating. And I was reading a lot of Mary's letters, and in the language of the time, which Tony used so eloquently, you know, you want to try to think like that. And so the only way we had to do that, in lieu of writing letters, which is how they communicated with each other when they were not together, and that would have taken a long time, the only thing we had other than email, and he doesn't email, which is okay. And you don't want to call. I'm in Los Angeles. He's in Ireland. Besides that, I hate talking on the phone, and I would have hated that. So the thing that's left is to text, and it made total sense, and it was completely generous and lovely because it was a way to become slightly familiar with each other, using the language and being the characters. It made total sense. It would have been weird had it not been the characters. I mean, would have weird, really weird. So it was lovely. And I have cherished every text.
It's like writing a letter.
Say it again? It's just like writing a letter. It was just literally like writing those short letters. I was just reading. And it was fabulous because I would have to really look at those letters, look at the language, and try to, you know, use that in the text. I envisioned him writing dashing his off really quickly, whereas I was like painstakingly trying to piece them together. If you dashed them off, lie to me.
Mr. Spader, I think one of the things that people learn from your character is that Lincoln, who but you know, I think a lot of people learn or come to believe was beyond reproach. He was godlike, would never play politics, even though he was in the political arena. In fact, that was not the case, and I know, working from the research of Mr. Kushner, I just wonder if the two of you can talk about showing that side of Lincoln that was calculating and not necessarily in a bad way, but that's the way things get done. And so I just wonder, you know, for you, what that process of discovery was like.
Lobbying was a practice that really started with the first Congress, but it was really practice, and it was still practice at this time as well, but it was certainly more by the seat of your pants and amateurish and just the way life was at that time, where people met in taverns and the president rode a carriage through the streets and greeted people in the streets. You know, it was just a little more amateurish, lobbying certainly, became a little bit more institutionalized near the end of that century into the next. But, you know, that's democracy at its very best. Discourse and argument and compromise and persuasion, and as a means to the most perfect end, which happens to be what made this amendment worthy of making a film about. You know, I think it shows it defines what our democracy can be when it's working at its most active and with the most amount of argument and discourse and then compromise. Tony, take it from there.
Well, no, I mean, I think that sums it up. I mean, you know, the idea that Lincoln wasn't a political figure is, you know, I mean, the reason that Doris's book was so important to us is that she's a political writer and a person steeped in the politics of Washington. And, you know, the book is a political life of Lincoln and an appreciation of his incredible skill. I mean, she worked for Johnson. She understood how, important it is to have a president who knows how to work both in completely upfront ways and some behind-the-scene ways with Congress. So I will say one of the great joys for me during the shooting of the film is that I think a couple of days after I got to Richmond at the very beginning, I was told to call James. I don't think we'd ever met or anything before that. And because there were all these scenes that were going to be shot without sound. They were part of a montage of the three guys, the three henchmen is what we call them, bribing congressmen. And James wanted to talk about what he would say in those scenes. And we actually sort of cobbled together this series of, I think, really, really funny scenes. Bits and pieces of them made their way.
For those lip readers out there.
Yeah, it's hysterical. But it was an enormous amount.
I mean, there was certainly speculation that much more provocative things happened in service of the passage of this amendment, which, because Tony and Steven, I certainly wasn't part of this at all, but there was certainly speculation that much more, that votes were bought and that cash exchanged hands. There's certainly been speculation that those things happened. And, you know, there certainly were implications in the film, but that kind of thing was very active from, I think, Samuel Colt very early on was handing out pistols to try and extend his patents on his firearms. And that was going on from the very first Congress and is obviously going on today.
I think I actually found a plot. We kept trying to work it into the movie, and it kept getting pushed out because there just wasn't time. Where I think Lincoln actually recruited Mary in this, and she used her connection to Charles Sumner in the Senate to kill an anti-monopoly bill in exchange for the abstentions that you hear from the New Jersey senators, both of whom mysteriously didn't show up that day for the vote. And I think we'll never know because none of this was written down, but I have a suspicion that it was Mary's active involvement, and it didn't make it into the final cut.
Well, after this 4-month immersion in 19th century life, when this came to an end, it must have been hard for everyone, but particularly I would think for you, Mr. Spielberg, you, Mr. Day-Lewis, to kind of come out of this. And I just wonder, I've read, Mr. Day-Lewis, where you said that it's always hard to come out of it. That's partly why you've taken a few years between a lot of your projects. But for this one, can you talk about how it came to an end, and was it difficult to say goodbye?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's been expressed in such a way it's a little misleading, because it's almost as if the implication is that some exorcism has to take place to allow you to go about your normal business. But it's not that at all. I can't say for sure that's what accounts for my periods of time in between. It may be one of the things, but much more than that need to rid oneself is actually the reluctance to let go. And that really seems to make complete sense to me. There's nothing supernatural about it. It's really, one has explored a life as thoroughly as one has been able to, and the world that surrounded that life with a group of people very, very closely. One has gone to inordinate lengths to try and construct that illusion for oneself so that it might present a believable illusion for others. And therefore, there's enormous reluctance to move away from that, because most of us do what we do. And certainly in this case, I think without exception, sometimes there's a core group of you that are doing what you're doing because you're compelled to do it, and you're not always surrounded by people that have the same degree of compulsion. But in this case, I felt that every single person involved was happy and felt nourished to be doing that work that they were doing. And yes, it's a sense of tremendous sadness to think that that part of one's relationship with that world and those lives has come to an end. But the beauty of it is that you go back to enjoy that world and those lives from a different perspective again.
And Mr. Spielberg, had you ever worked so closely with another actor on a film before, and having that come to an end for you?
Well, I can't compare this to any other working experience I've ever had. Just every single level of Lincoln was unprecedented in my experience. But I will tell you that in the 4 months of shooting Lincoln, I actually made friends with Abraham Lincoln. And on the last shot of the film, at the end of Lincoln's life, when he was at the Peterson House, sort of bent in half because he was even too tall to have his feet all the way out to the end of the bed. And that was the last shot of the picture. When we all disbanded and we went back to our rooms, and Daniel went back to his room, and I went to thank the crew and have some people stand up and be called out to take a bow. I heard that Daniel wanted to see Tony and I, and we both went into his trailer, and he was there as Abraham Lincoln. But when we were finished hugging and all of our eyes were wet, Daniel spoke to me as Daniel Day-Lewis, and the voice that you all hear tonight. And that's when I wept, because that's when I realized that that was the last time I was ever going to be, friends with a person who I really came to believe was our 16th president. And I have not asked him if he would do it again for my birthday. in 2.5 weeks. But I'm not going to ask him that, because he'll say no.
If we can, I'd like to invite a few questions from the audience. And so we'll go to this person in the back. And just because we are recording, I will repeat your question if I can hear it. So please go ahead. So I guess the primary question for Mr. Kushner and Mr. Spielberg, was there ever any consideration to using the vote as sort of a spine of the film and returning to it periodically while mixing in the rest of the narrative, or was it always intended to culminate with that?
No, it was always intended to be what you pretty much saw. The spine of the narrative is not only the acquisition of the necessary votes to pass the amendment, but also when to pass the amendment and when to end the war. And that is the huge weight that Lincoln balanced, the great balancing act of Abraham Lincoln in the last 4 months of his life, and the blood left on his hands because the vote, it was necessary to abolish slavery before the war ended. And they abolished slavery and signed it into law February 1st. It hadn't been ratified yet, but it was signed by Lincoln February 1st. War didn't end for another 3 months. And that's a lot of blood on his hands. And that was a big sort of moral balance in the story.
I mean, actually, when we first met with Daniel in Ireland, there were a couple of flashbacks. The vote was always at the end of the segment of the movie. There were a couple of small flashbacks to other things, and Daniel was the person who said, "Do we really need to do flashbacks?" Which immediately we both agreed, let's get rid of the flashbacks. I mean, because there's a sense of being in the here and now in the film that I think we were all consciously and unconsciously working towards. Also, the struggle to tell this story clearly when you have to sort of catch everybody in the audience up on the Alice of the Looking Glass world of the Democrats being reactionaries and the Republicans being a progressive party, and then 2/3 majority needed to pass a vote in the House and the Senate, and all of those little specifics. And we worked all the way through this summer with Steven sort of, maybe we need a card here, maybe we need a tweak here, to try and make it really something that people could follow. And I think that in addition to the fact that we liked the way that it built to the big basketball game at the end with this little team winning the state championship, we also, I think it would have made what was already a formidable challenge of this fairly unfamiliar terrain even more difficult to follow. So we never considered that.
There's a hand right over here. Yes? Sure.
Yes.
Just essentially the question was, I guess, making this film in these times, and with, I guess you could also note another president from Illinois, lawyer turned politician, made his Secretary of State, or made his political rival his Secretary of State, pushed controversial legislation through in his first term, and on and on and on. Was there
actually
consciousness?
Knows how to write a sentence.
Pardon me?
A president who actually knows how to write.
Right.
Is,
So was that something that you were deliberately emphasizing?
No, because the film was written during the Bush administration. Absolutely true. That when we were at the Kennedy Center Honors, President Bush came over to me and along with Condoleezza Rice, and they had both devoured Doris's book, and they were asking me all about what part of the book we were going to try to make into a movie. And at that point, we didn't have 100% agreement on exactly what part of the story of the passage of the 13th Amendment we were going to tell, or even were we going to tell anything about the Emancipation Proclamation. There were a lot of things that we were still juggling, but it was interesting that they had both read the book and didn't quite know how to answer that question at the time.
She read the book. Well, I don't know, but
It's okay.
We'll go over here. Yes. So how did you arrive at the voice, Mr. Dalis?
Luckily for me, there are no recordings from that time, but there is a really amazing national archive of early recordings, and I think the earliest of them are probably around the turn of the century, early 1900s. And I suppose really it's looking for clues. That's one of the sort of early stages of things, is to look for clues. In this case, they're pretty clear ones, because the early influences in his life were the first few years in Kentucky, followed by Indiana, and then Springfield, Illinois. And so, you know, I managed to find some recordings from the counties in those 3 states where he spent that early, very influential part of his life. But we don't really know necessarily that people in that part of the world spoke in exactly the same way as they do now. So it's all really up for grabs. And what I tend to do, because the voice is such a, whenever I'm working, it's such a deep personal reflection of character that it's not something I would seek to find or choose to go looking for at an early stage. In fact, I never really consciously do, but I work my way kind of through, across that line, towards something. And at a certain moment, if I'm lucky, I begin to hear a voice. The accumulation of what I understand about that life at a certain moment allows me to hear a sound. And it may well be the wrong one, but if it is, generally I'm stuck with it because, but then that internal sound, the sound as it would be of your own internal monologue, then if I live with it for a bit and that sound, I like that sound, it pleases me, then I try to reproduce it, which is that can become a problem in itself. That's I know that's probably hasn't answered your question, but sorry.
We have time for last two questions, so we'll go to this person over here. Gentlemen, go ahead. Yes?
Brilliant film, really, even just down to the smallest detail of the 100-something extras, small parts. You can tell that you love each individual role and passion for it especially. But I'll ask you one question that's kind of off the topic. When are you going to make a Western?
So the question is for Mr. Spielberg, when are you going to make a Western?
Well, didn't you like Cowboys and Aliens? I don't say that sarcastically. I actually enjoyed the film, and my company made that film. I didn't make the picture. My company did. But look, I've been looking to make a Western for a long time. A Western and a musical, so whichever comes first. I don't know. Got to be the right one.
And finally, let's go way in the back. Give somebody a chance, or even up here. Yes, go ahead. Yes. We got a gentleman up here. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you all for joining us, first off, and happy birthday.
Soon, thank you.
You went through so many different versions and so many different rewrites, and you said you went through so many different sections of the story. And, you know, it doesn't feel like a lot of different pieces. It feels very complete. What were you looking for to get you there? If you have a question in mind that you're thinking about, and you're putting it all together.
Was there a driving question that you wanted to answer as you tried to figure out how to approach the script, Mr. Kushner, Mr. Spielberg?
Well, I think the thing that was the most interesting part of any, let's say, a Lincoln portrait is how do we want to see Lincoln? Do we want to see him as a monument already? Do we want to see him like a statuary? Do we want to see him as we expect to see him, so famous that he's almost invisible? Or do we want to see him as a thriving, living, involved, enthralled human being with all of his faults and all of his flaws and his distance with one son and closeness to the other and irreconcilable love with and for his wife? And how do you do all that in a length of time that isn't a miniseries? And Tony and I felt that we needed to hang it on an issue so we could see him as a working president. We weren't interested in turning him into a deity. He's been deified enough. We were interested in bringing him off his marble pedestal and rolling up his sleeves and getting the most important job that I think anyone has ever done with our Constitution, which is to abolish slavery, once and for all. And because that happened to happen just before the Civil War ended and just before Lincoln ended, it just seemed like this was the narrative force of history that drove us to follow precisely the historical record in being able to dramatize and humanize Lincoln all within a reasonable amount of running time.
Yeah. I'll just add, when the huge long script was January, February, March, and April, and when I sent the whole monstrous thing to Steven, I thought that he was going to want to make the last month, which was when Lincoln went down to City Point and was there for the end of the war. And it's very cinematic. It has boats on the river and not battle scenes, but the aftermath of battles and all sorts of really extraordinary visual things going on. And I was certain that the first part of the script, which was the fight for the amendment, was going to be the least interesting. And Steven immediately said, that's my favorite part of the script. And so gradually everything else fell away. And it's been an enormous, this is only my second film, it's been an enormously eye-opening and even humbling experience that I didn't know what you were up to the whole time. But now that I see the movie, this was the perfect story because it does give the possibility of seeing him in an enclosed space and doing things like putting wood on the fire and so on, and the pacing of it and everything. It's just been, he had the whole thing in his head the whole time, and it's an amazing thing. It's why it's a great privilege to work with him.
Thank you, Tony. But it was also on paper. Please, Tony's being very kind, but this was a script that we didn't want to change. Even when Tony kept wanting to rewrite the script, our big job was, Tony, it's great, don't change too much. Because Tony's very fluid about things, and he hears something, and then he hears another way to say something, which was very valuable throughout the entire process. But this was, I think, just prior to shooting, I would say just about a week before we started shooting, we had a lock on the script, and we all went to Richmond, tremendously confident that we had a great thing in our hands, a great play that was going to be a movie. That was sort of always a movie, but there's so much literature in this particular story that we could then focus on other things because the words were there. We could then focus on character, on atmosphere, on lighting, on set dressing, on just the whole feeling of hair and makeup and wardrobe. We could just focus on all of these amazing skills that combine to make any movie that we work on and that we see possible. Not just successful, but possible.
Well, all that is left to say, I guess, is thank you guys so much for being here and for doing this and for a great film. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.